Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly through the back doors of a medieval convent. The wind rustles the tall grass outside and the heavy wooden gates creak shut behind you. Candles flicker in narrow hallways as you make your way toward the cloistered kitchen. Not for super bread, but for something far more unexpected. Beer. Yes, you're here for nun brewed ale. You duck under low stone arches and step into the chilly brewing chamber, where the smell of boiling grain and warm yeast clings to the damp air. A pot the size of a horse trough bubbles slowly on a blackened hearth. Nearby, a nun in a heavy wool habit stirs the mash with a wooden paddle taller than she is. Her sleeves are rolled, cheeks ruddy, and her brow is furrowed like someone calculating the perfect malt ratio, not contemplating scripture. And no, she's not breaking any rules. She's fulfilling a holy duty. You probably won't survive this. Not because the nuns are dangerous, though they can wield a mean stirring stick, but because their brewing schedule starts before dawn and involves lugging 40-pound sacks of barley uphill while chanting psalms. Imagine CrossFit, but celibate and yeast-infused. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake by the end, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle into a corner bench, careful not to knock over a pewter ladle. The convent isn't grand. It's not made for wealth. Everything here is practical, rough-hewn and quiet. But that doesn't mean it lacks charm. The brewing space is alive, bustling, even in hushed tones. You hear the scrape of malt bags, the occasional burst of laughter, and the muttered prayers that seem to wrap around each bubbling cauldron like steam. Why, you wonder, are they even brewing at all? It's simple. In the medieval world, beer isn't just a treat, it's necessity. Water, especially in towns and walled communities, is often contaminated. Rivers double as laundromats, latrines, and livestock baths. You'd think twice before drinking from that. Beer, on the other hand, has been boiled, fermented. It's got alcohol, even in its weakest forms. That makes it far safer for daily drinking, and that includes breakfast. Yes, nuns drank beer in the morning. The early batches were called small beer, with low alcohol content and a thin, bready flavor. Think of it like oat milk's weird cousin, grainy, cloudy, and faintly bitter, but comforting. And warm. And if you've been up since 3 a.m., scraping candle drippings off altar cloths, you're probably not too picky. Outside, the sun rises in streaks of pale gold, catching on the tops of apple trees just beyond the wall. You imagine yourself lifting a wooden mug with both hands. It's not just hydration, it's ritual. Part of the rhythm of convent life. Just as essential as matins or mass. Interestingly, some historians still argue whether nuns took their beer craft from monks or developed it independently. The records aren't clear, mostly because nobody thought to write down. Sister Agnes invented a brilliant new mashing method today. But clues remain, scrawled in the margins of old recipe books or tucked into letters between abbeys. And unlike monks, who often brewed in larger male-dominated monasteries with generous funding and huge cellars, nuns had to do more with less. Their breweries were compact, their gear often homemade. Yet, time and again, you find accounts of their beer being unusually good. One noblewoman wrote of visiting a convent in northern France, where the beer was so fine and smooth it must have been kissed by angels. That's a lot of praise for a drink that, let's be honest, often tasted like slightly spoiled porridge. You watch one nun as she pours a new batch through layers of cloth stretched over a barrel. She hums a hymn you don't know, and you notice her hands, scarred from hot mash spills, strong from years of work. There's nothing performative about her task, it's just life. A life shaped by seasons, brewing cycles, and prayer bells. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with women brewing. Later centuries saw rules shift, guilds formed, And eventually, male brewers would edge women out of the business entirely, but we're not there yet. Right now, in this small convent tucked between fields and forests, women run the show. And they do it well. Not because they want to compete with monks, but because someone has to make sure there's clean beer for the Feast of St. Mildred. And because Sister Elfrida has a knack for timing the boil just right. The brew pot hisses as more firewood is added. A sister fans the flames with a stitched cloth that reads, Ora et labora, pray and work. She wipes her brow, sips a bit of cooled wort, and nods. It's good. And so, as the first full casks are hauled into a cellar chilled by thick stone walls, you realize this isn't some quirky footnote of history. This is history. Alive, warm, bubbling away under the care of women whose lives were as much about hops as hymns. You lean back. The room hums around you. And somewhere in the shadows, a novice carefully etches a tally into a wax tablet. One more batch, safely brewed. The air is thicker now, warmer, richer. You step carefully through the brew room as the sun lifts over the convent wall, sending pale shafts of light across wooden barrels and soot-darkened beams. It's not even breakfast yet, but the sisters have already been at it for hours. And now it's time for a pint. Yes, really. You take a seat at a long, slightly wobbly wooden table. A sister you've not yet met, round-cheeked, sleeves rolled up, sets down a small wooden mug in front of you. It's filled with small beer, the medieval version of morning coffee. If your coffee was made of malted barley, boiled hops, and the faint memory of yesterday's yeast. You sip. It's surprisingly smooth. Thin, slightly sour with just a ghost of bitterness. Not refreshing exactly, but oddly satisfying, like a liquid biscuit that's decided to go a little funky. There's no sugar, no carbonation, no brand label with a quirky name like St. Swithin's Saison. This is functional, humble, but still crafted with care. You glance around and notice each nun has her own rhythm to the day's brewing. One is crushing barley underfoot using a stone roller. Another is feeding scraps of mashed grain to the pigs through a hole in the outer wall. And two more are checking yesterday's casks for leaks by candlelight. No talking, just motion. Steam. Chores stacked on chores. You might be wondering why beer, of all things, was allowed in these religious settings. Shouldn't they have been holier? Well, funny you ask. The thing is, beer wasn't seen as sinful. In fact, it was often viewed as a gift from God, clean, nourishing, and ideal for fasting periods when meat and dairy were banned. Monasteries and convents produced it not just for themselves, but for guests, the poor and pilgrims. Brewing was part charity, part sustenance, part economics. And in places where fresh water was a gamble, beer was the safer option by a long shot. There's a reason medieval people drank beer all day, from dawn until dusk. Even children got their share. It had lower alcohol back then, maybe 1 to 2%, but it was enough to kill bacteria and keep the flu at bay. Or so they hoped. Historians still argue whether the reliance on beer in daily monastic life was more about faith, health, or just taste. Probably a bit of all three. But one thing's for sure, nuns weren't just passively sipping, they were actively brewing, constantly. You stand again, wandering toward the grain store where burlap sacks are stacked high. Sister Matilda is sorting malt by hand, tossing out anything that smells off or looks moldy. She catches your eye and gives you a conspiratorial nod, like someone who knows her barley better than most know their psalms. She leans in and murmurs, "Never trust a man who brews with last season's grain." Then she winks. Your morning continues in slow, steady layers. You follow the scent trail from boiling pot to cooling trough. You trace finger-worn grooves on the oak stirring paddles, marveling at how deeply the brewing cycle has embedded itself into convent life. Every tool has a place. Every step a purpose. Even breakfast is beer-infused. The bread is baked using spent grains, dense, chewy, and still warm. One nun slices it with a dagger-like knife, while humming a tune that may or may not be about St. Bridget's miracle ale. And as you eat, you realize something. These women aren't just surviving, they're thriving. They're engineers, chemists, botanists, and managers, all under the guise of simple sisters of the cloth. They read weather patterns and cloud shapes, adjust brew times based on humidity, and know how to coax flavor from grain with the precision of any Michelin-starred chef. One quirky tidbit you overhear is that some nuns would sing to their beer as it cooled. Soft lullabies, believed to keep the yeast calm and the fermentation smooth. A superstition? Sure. But given how few batches ever spoiled, you wonder if there's something to it. Or maybe the yeast just liked Gregorian chant. As the day stretches forward, the brewing process doesn't stop. Batches overlap. Mash turns to wort. Wort turns to ale. Everything in motion. You pass by a line of clay jars, each labeled in Latin shorthand: Fortis, Dulcis, Acidula, strong, sweet, sour. Different beer types for different occasions. Maybe Fortis for visiting bishops, Dulcis for feast days, and Acidula for cleaning wounds or scrubbing floors. You're not entirely sure. Outside you hear the bells ring, mid-morning prayers. But inside, the brew must go on. The mash is stirred again. Ash is cleared from the fire pit. A nun scoops foam from the surface with the delicacy of someone handling communion wafers. You're invited to help, but only once you've washed your hands in the lavender basin near the door. That's right. Even medieval nuns had hygiene standards. As you reach for a ladle and begin to stir, you notice how heavy the mixture feels. Not just in weight, but in meaning. This is sustenance, community, history. And somewhere, deep beneath the everyday clatter of the brewing hall, you sense a quiet kind of joy. The kind that comes from doing something well, even if no one outside these walls will ever know your name. Your arms are still warm from stirring the mash when you're waved gently toward the back of the convent, down a dim corridor where a thick wooden door waits half open. You step through into a smaller chamber that smells of old parchment, beeswax, and you swear, nutmeg. This is the brewery ledger room, though it might look more like a library at first glance. But it's not just any room with books. It's where the true genius of the brewing nuns reveals itself. Inside, three sisters sit hunched over wooden desks. Each one is focused, writing by lamplight in careful script. Their fingers are stained with ink and herbs. In front of them lie recipe books, long, narrow scrolls and bound ledgers filled with beer formulas, notes on grain quality, seasonal timing charts, and whimsical marginalia like tiny doodles of sheep and barley stalks. This is where beer becomes art. And Sister Cecile is the artist-in-chief. She doesn't say much when you approach. Just glances up with a knowing look, then gestures toward a vellum page with delicate gold-trimmed lettering. You read it aloud, slowly, phonetically. Aqua colida, hordeum dulce, salvia ruta et mel. Warm water, sweet barley, sage, rue, and honey. It's a recipe for an autumn ale meant to soothe upset stomachs and long fasts. Cecile taps the corner of the page where a faded thumbprint marks the entry. Mother Bertha's brew, she says softly, still unmatched. You realize the sisters aren't just copying from older books. They're innovating, adjusting, creating. Every batch is a blend of science and sacred habit. You flip through more pages and see that they kept extensive notes on what worked and what didn't. One entry reads, Batch 17, too bitter. Sister Agnes dropped the lemon balm in twice. No one tell her. You smile. Historians still argue whether these recipe books were standard across convents or unique to each. Some say the formats match closely, implying widespread training or shared guides. Others believe every abbess curated her own brewing school shaped by local tastes and herbs. The truth may never be clear, but one thing is certain. These women were deliberate. They knew which herbs added warmth, which ones clarified cloudy beer, and which had side effects. There's a faint notation beside a formula with mugwort that simply reads, "Too lively for prayer." You learned that the convent kept seasonal charts, tables for when to start malt drying based on moon cycles, and when to let wild yeast do its job. These weren't just chores, they were ceremonies. Observed, honored. Back in the brewing hall, you notice that some nuns wear small wooden tokens around their necks. Round medallions carved with barley, hops, or pitchers. These aren't decorative. They're their brewing specialties. Sister Claire, for instance, has a little mug with foam carved at the top. She's the fermentation lid. As you trail behind her into the next chamber, you're hit with a waft of cloves and dried rose petals. This is the spice room. You didn't expect this, did you? Sacks and bundles hang from the rafters, each one tied with dyed thread and labeled in looping Latin. Sage for bitterness, anise for perfume, juniper for the crisp winter brew they only make once a year, and yes, nutmeg. Imported, expensive, and used only for feast day ales that mark saints' days or rare celestial events. You run your fingers gently along a shelf filled with dried bark and citrus peels. It feels like a medieval version of a mixologist's bar, if your mixologist also kept bees and made candles on the side. A nun named Sister Odila invites you to smell something sharp and citrusy from her mortar. She's grinding coriander and fennel together, muttering a prayer that sounds like both recipe and blessing. You ask her how she knows how much to add. She chuckles. The beer tells you. That's the thing here. Brewing isn't just measured in spoons and scoops. It's in memory, in weather, in instinct. That's what makes Sister Brewmasters so powerful. They carry centuries of unspoken knowledge, shared from mouth to ear, hand to hand. No guilds, no trade secrets, just tradition. You pause at a workbench where one of the novices is carefully dipping beeswax onto a scroll to seal a finished recipe. She's only 16, but already she knows the sugar curve of boiled wort by taste. Her handwriting is shaky, but her palate, deadly accurate. And then you hear the bell again. Midday. The sisters drift from every chamber, gathering for prayers. You stay behind a moment longer, reading one final line in a brewing note that catches your eye. Let it sit. The good things come slowly. You exhale. Seems like a decent brewing rule. And maybe a decent life rule, too. The midday bell fades into silence, and for the first time in hours, the convent feels utterly still. You walk alone down a passage lined with clay jars, some glazed, some chipped, most faintly sticky around the rims. This is the fermentation corridor, where the beer, having been coaxed into life by heat and herbs, is now left to become itself. You stop in front of a cask marked only with a painted cross and the word quadragesima. That's Latin for Lent. Wait, beer for Lent? Oh, yes. See, during the strict fasting periods of the medieval calendar, solid food was often prohibited. But liquids? That was a divine loophole. And beer was the holy gray area the nuns stepped into with considerable enthusiasm. You imagine yourself here during the harsh chill of a 14th century March morning. Your stomach is empty. You've just completed lauds and your fingers ache from scrubbing altar linens. But in the fermentation hall, a nun ladles out a deep amber-colored ale. Slightly thicker, heartier than the morning brew. It's the Lenten batch, high in nutrients, low in guilt. To the nuns, beer wasn't indulgence, it was preservation. They believed God provided through grain, and fermentation was merely unlocking the potential of his gift. One scholar you might overhear in a modern pub will say, Lenten beer was practically bread in a cup. But others argue that the line between survival and celebration was blurrier than most monks like to admit. Especially when the fast day beers were so tasty they could make even a bishop hum. Gregorian tunes in a higher octave. Historians still argue whether these fast ales were intentionally more potent, or if that was just a happy accident. What we do know is that many convents brewed special batches just for these holy seasons, and they were proud of it. As you walk, you notice little chalk marks above certain barrels, symbols resembling stars, loaves, even fish. These are shorthand for feast days, special ingredients, or the rare brew that included honey and was meant to be consumed only on Easter morning. That one's locked in a cupboard, though. Even nuns have their temptations. You run your fingers along the tops of the barrels. Some are warm to the touch, mid-fermentation. Others are cool, already aged and ready for bottling. The scent in the room is layered, earthy, tangy, with notes of dried fruit and yeast that seems to hum under your skin. In the far corner, Sister Margareta is whispering something into a vat. You blink. Did she just talk to the beer? Yes. Yes, she did. It's part ritual, part superstition, and part stress management. The yeast you see is a living thing, and the nuns believe that kindness, even in tone, helps it thrive. Some speak prayers over their brews, others sing. One nun years ago was rumored to recite full psalms in Latin, carefully timing her vocal cadence with the bubbling of her favorite barrel. Odd? Sure. But when Sister Margareta's brew is tapped, even visiting abbots request a second mug. The fermentation process takes days, sometimes weeks. Temperature, airflow, and yeast behavior all matter. And the sisters have no thermometers, no lab coats, just linen cloths, weathered fingers, and an intuitive sense of timing so accurate you'd think they were born with a built-in sundial. You take a moment to sit beside a stack of filled jugs, corked and sealed with red wax stamped with the convent crest. A barley stalk wrapped in a rosary. There's a kind of holiness here, not in robes or rituals, but in repetition. In the quiet conviction that brewing, like prayer, requires presence. That attention to detail is its own form of devotion. That yeast is just as miraculous as incense. Outside, you hear the faint clatter of buckets being rinsed. The next brew cycle begins even before the last one ends. That's the other thing about nun-run breweries. They never stop. They can't. With guests arriving, novices to feed, and barrels to tithe, the need is constant. One fringe record mentions a convent in Bavaria that brewed 6 times a week, with each sister rotating roles like clockwork. One to gather herbs, one to stir, one to sing to the fermenting batch, one to handle storage. It was a rhythm, a dance, a foamy liturgy. As you rise, you notice something taped. Yes, taped to a support beam. A very modern laminated sign that says, "Do not touch the Lenten strong." It's a modern historical site now, preserved by the local town. But back when it was just the sisters, you can imagine the mischief that little barrel saw, especially during Lent. So you step quietly past the sacred suds, careful not to bump anything. The air is getting cooler again as you exit the fermentation corridor, moving toward the cellar vaults. But you'll remember this room, because even if the ingredients are humble, grain, water, herbs, the result is anything but. And in these silent casks, where nuns once whispered lullabies to yeast, you realize something profound. This wasn't just beer. It was patience. In liquid form. The stone stairs creak as you descend into the convent's deepest corridor, the scriptorium. It's cooler down here. The kind of cool that settles into your sleeves and socks like quiet advice. Beeswax candles sputter in wall niches. And then, just ahead, you see them. Rows of wooden desks angled for writing. Their surfaces scattered with parchment, inkwells, and the faint outline of something unexpected. Beer. More precisely, beer recipes. You pause, listening to the soft scratch of quills. A sister is bent low over a manuscript, copying something carefully, each letter rendered in dark ink with just enough flourish to suggest she's enjoying herself. You peer over her shoulder. The page shows a list of ingredients written in neat Latin. But this isn't just some monastic grocery list. It's a coded recipe, one that includes phrases like "a pinch for peace" and "boil until the memory of bitterness fades." You glance around and realize this is where they've hidden the knowledge. Among prayer books, botanical journals, and hymnals, the nuns have tucked away centuries of brewing wisdom. Their recipe books don't live on dusty tavern shelves. They live here, quietly cataloged under saints' names and fasting schedules. You pick up a small leather-bound volume. Inside, a whole chapter is devoted to festive ales, complete with marginalia, tiny doodles of jugs, and one suspiciously cheeky-looking squirrel holding a stein. Sister Beatrice, the archive lead, sees your amusement. "Oh, that's Sister Alina's doing," she says. She liked to illustrate the more cheerful brews, said they tasted better with a smile. It's hard to argue with that. The records here aren't just recipes, though. They include brewing notes, corrections, substitutions, weather observations, even mood annotations. One page in a slightly more rushed hand reads, "Rained during boil. Firewood damp. Result, sour. Pray for sun tomorrow." There's something deeply human in these lines. You feel less like a historian and more like a time traveler reading the anxious joys of a brewer who simply wanted her batch to turn out well. You leaf through another volume, this one containing healing brews. These aren't beers for pleasure but for purpose. Tonic-like ales brewed with chamomile, hyssop, rosemary, or dried elderflower. Some were for stomach ailments. Others were intended for women in childbirth. And one recipe in particular stands out, Ale of Mercy, meant to be served to the poor who came knocking during the plague seasons. Historians still debate whether these herbal ales had measurable medicinal value or whether they were just well-meant placebo. But either way, the effort, the intentionality, is undeniable. And sometimes results speak louder than data. As you lean against a desk, your eyes land on a particularly weathered scroll. Its corners are crumbling, but the ink has held firm. The Latin is older, less refined, but you can just make out the title, De Cervicia Sororum, On the Beer of the Sisters. It's a kind of brewing philosophy, a mixture of instruction and reflection. It reads, "The barley does not rush. The fire does not shout. The yeast does not strive. Thus we too shall brew." Poetic. Almost frustratingly calm. You begin to understand that for the nuns, beer wasn't a side job or even a source of income. It was an extension of their spiritual rhythm. A form of obedience, not just to rule or tradition, but to nature, to time, to patience. There's one page stained in the corner, probably from wort or spilled honey, that outlines a silent brew. A day where all work is done without speaking, where ingredients are handled in total quiet from mash to keg. The idea that the beer would absorb peace. Some scholars scoff at this. Others write entire dissertations on it. But you think about the way your own mood changes when you stir soup versus when you rush through it. About how kneading bread by hand sometimes calms you more than any guided meditation. So maybe there's something to it. A bell tolls faintly above, probably drawing the sisters to their next prayers. But you linger. One last page catches your eye. It's unsigned. Just a few lines of verse tucked into the back of a ledger. Grain is the body, water the soul, yeast the spirit that makes it whole. You read it twice. Then you close the book softly as if not to wake anything sleeping. In the flickering candlelight, the scriptorium feels less like a room of records and more like a chapel. A chapel devoted not to saints or relics, but to the ancient earthy magic of fermentation. To the sacred act of transforming what is common into something life-sustaining. And in a way, isn't that what faith is? You leave the scriptorium with a head full of parchment-scented thoughts and descend into the side storeroom. A quieter, less sacred-looking space, where the magic gets a little messier. Here the shelves are a chaotic joy. Clay pots sit beside wicker baskets filled with curling leaves and brittle stems. There are glass vials stoppered with wax, dusty bundles of dried root tied with red string, and something labeled caution, wormwood, in unusually large lettering. This is the ingredient room, where brewing experiments begin and occasionally go horribly sideways. You reach for a jar filled with knobbly brown bulbs that look a bit like shrunken potatoes. A sister nearby notices and chuckles. "Don't let those fool you, that's marshmallow root." Very soothing. Terrible in soup. Sister Gertrude, the nun in charge of herbs, seems to float through the room stirring dust with her robes. She doesn't carry a clipboard. She doesn't need to. Everything here is organized in a system that exists only in her head. You ask how she remembers what's what. She shrugs. If you forget, the brew will remind you. Today she's sorting through the alternatives to hops. Yes, alternatives. Because for most of early medieval brewing history, hops weren't the standard. They were regional, seasonal, and frankly, controversial. Before hops took center stage, brewers leaned on a curious collection of plants known collectively as groat. That could mean a blend of sweet gale, yarrow, mugwort, rosemary, or even wild carrot seeds. Some bittered the beer, some flavored it. Let's just say some did things you'd need a confession for. You touch a bundle of bog myrtle, an old Groot favorite known for giving ales a sharp, almost piney snap. Sister Gertrude explains that bog myrtle was prized in the north, but here in the valley, it grows angry. You decide not to ask what that means. There's one bundle that looks unassuming. Dried broom. Yellow flowers, now wilted and brown. Sister Gertrude picks it up like it's something sacred. "Don't let this one fool you," she whispers. Too much, and the whole convent ends up seeing angels during Vespers. Apparently, broom contains psychoactive compounds. Back in the day, it was used sparingly, or sometimes not sparingly enough. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of certain Groot herbs was always intentional, or if some brewing sisters simply got creative on cold winter nights. One account from a Flemish abbey describes a batch so spiritually lively that the head nun had to forbid singing during meals for a full week. You can imagine the scene. Sisters hiccuping hymns, beat-faced, trying to recite Latin through Snickers. Fringe facts aside, this room is a marvel of medieval botanical science. There's fennel for sweetness, thyme to preserve, wormwood to ward off spoilage and possibly friends, and even crushed juniper berries for that foresty zing. The blending of these ingredients wasn't random. It was calculated, tested, remembered. You thumb through a small parchment pad hanging on a hook that lists various mood ales: calming, warming, invigorating, sleep-inducing. One recipe is titled Sopor Ale, Sleep Ale. Ingredients include honey, chamomile, lavender, and something called quietwort, which may or may not just be a poetic name for lemon balm. It's unclear. The recipe ends with the note, "Served warm to the sister who cannot silence her mind." You think of all the late-night thinkers in the world who'd give anything for a quietwort brew. It gets easy to forget, standing here amid flowers and dust, that these brewing nuns weren't operating in isolation. They were plugged into a wider web of herbal knowledge, passed from one generation to another. Some learned from midwives, others from pilgrims. Some may have even taken tips from traveling Moorish scholars who passed through Europe with spice pouches and stories. Brewing was porous like that, absorbing influences like a sponge soaks up flavor. And these sisters? They were listening. Of course, not all experiments went well. One scroll pinned to the wall details the incident of the black batch, in which too much licorice root turned an entire cask into something resembling medieval cough syrup. It was served once. The rest was used to waterproof the convent roof. Even failures had function. You take one last look around and notice a tiny wooden drawer labeled simply oddments. Inside, dried orange peel, rose petals, a pebble with a cross scratched into it, and 3 withered cloves wrapped in silk. What is it for? No one seems to know. But the drawer stays undisturbed, like a quiet reminder that even the most seasoned brewers must leave room for the unknown. Outside, a bell rings again. Afternoon chores await. Sister Gertrude pats your arm and says, "Best go now." The barley's waiting, and the broom's starting to whisper again. You don't wait to find out what she means. But as you climb the stairs, the scent of time clinging to your sleeves, you carry with you the knowledge that even in a convent of sacred vows and silent mornings, there existed this world. A playful, fragrant, fiercely experimental corner of brewing history where women dared to taste the world and make it better. Back in the courtyard, the wind has picked up a little. You watch it ripple through the herb garden and tug at the drying linen strung between kitchen windows. It smells like yeast and clover and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brays in a way that suggests it disapproves of your posture. But the real heat, the real battle, is happening behind the chapel. The nun versus monk brew-off. Okay, not literally. There aren't any beer-fueled brawls or hop grenades being hurled over monastery walls. But there was a quietly competitive undercurrent between female and male religious brewers. And it's more dramatic than you'd think. Let's set the scene. In medieval Europe, monasteries often get the spotlight when it comes to brewing. They had the land, the resources, the writing monks, with time to log their hoppy triumphs. But for every barrel stirred by a Benedictine brother, there was likely another simmering under the quiet watch of a convent sister. And she was probably working with far less and doing just as well. You peek inside the convent's equipment shed, where a gleaming copper kettle sits beside a beaten wooden mash paddle that looks more like a weapon than a tool. This is Sister Winifred's domain. You'd be forgiven for mistaking her for a blacksmith. She's strong, soot-smudged, and currently elbow-deep in a sack of hops. She gives you a nod of approval. You nod back, mostly because she's holding the paddle. Let's talk gear. Male monasteries typically had more advanced brewing equipment. Think large-scale tuns, purpose-built brew houses, sometimes even attached mills. Some could produce hundreds of gallons a week and export to local taverns. Meanwhile, convents made do with smaller-scale setups. Fewer tools, smaller pots, more recycled materials. But, and here's the surprise, they often outperform the monks on flavor and consistency. Why? Because while the monks had quantity, the nuns had precision and patience, and about 200 fewer interruptions a day. One abbess famously kept a ledger noting every minor brew variable: moon phase, wind direction, cat behavior, seriously, and prayer attendance. Her beer? Legendary. And then there's the question of who the beer was for. Monasteries often brewed for trade and hospitality. Monks entertained high-status guests, pilgrims, and sometimes even royalty. Convents, on the other hand, brewed for the community, for the sick, for the poor, for themselves. The focus was more inward, less showy, but the result, still delicious. Historians still argue whether convent ales were ever better in any objective sense. After all, no medieval TripAdvisor exists. But there are accounts of traveling clergy who preferred the delicate sweetness and clean taste of a nun's ale. One letter even mentions a bishop quietly sneaking away from his assigned monastery to drink at a nearby convent. He claimed it was for spiritual guidance, but the empties in his cart told a different story. And yes, there was sometimes tension. In parts of Germany and France, brewing guilds tried to ban convents from selling beer outside their walls, accusing them of unfair competition, likely because the sisters were undercutting prices and winning on taste. A few abbots petitioned the church to restrict nun-brewed ales entirely. The petitions failed. You step closer to Sister Winifred's setup and notice her thermometer. Except, it's not a thermometer. It's a bundle of goose feathers tied to a string suspended above the kettle. She watches how the steam makes the feathers dance. When they sway just right, she nods and throws in the herbs. Is it science? Is it art? Is it divine goose magic? Doesn't matter. The beer's good. One delightful fringe tidbit. Some convents name their beers Not just by season, but with actual titles. Sister Winifred's latest batch is called St. Mildred's Resilience, a winter ale with cloves, black pepper, and dried apple slices. Warming, gentle, very polite, but not without backbone. You wonder if the monks ever gave their beers names. Probably something grand like Abbot's Blessing or Trinitas Triple. The nuns, by contrast, preferred sly little jokes. One abbey listed their autumn brew as the quiet after Compline. Another? Not wine, but close. There's something charmingly subversive about it. You take a long breath, savoring the spiced air, and step back to compare the two brewing traditions again. Yes, monks had infrastructure, but nuns had instinct. Yes, monks had funding, but nuns had grit. And honestly, in a head-to-head taste test, you'd bet on Sister Winifred every time. Especially since she's now pouring a small ladle of wort into a clay mug and handing it to you with a look that says, "Don't embarrass yourself. You sip. It's rich, spicy, not quite beer yet, but it's on its way. A promise in liquid form." You hand it back. She nods. And just like that, you're part of the brew-off. No judgment, no scorecards. Just a shared understanding between two humans standing over a pot of future ale. You hear the wagon before you see it, a wooden creak, a rhythmic squeak, and the soft clinking of full ceramic jugs. You follow the sound out past the convent gates to the dusty road beyond, where two nuns in traveling cloaks are loading up barrels beside a small donkey who looks like he's seen too many feast days. This is distribution day. And if you thought medieval nuns stayed tucked behind stone walls all the time, think again. Welcome to the enterprising side of convent brewing, where sisters didn't just make beer, they made it work. See, the convent's not just a place of prayer and quiet devotion, it's a hub, a local fixture. And its beer surprisingly plays a central role in keeping everything running. Pilgrims stop here on their way to holy sites. Townsfolk come with trade goods. Sick children are brought in for healing herbs, and sometimes a dose of warming ale. Sister Juliana is in charge of today's run to the nearby village. She's quick, sharp-tongued, and seems to have memorized every rut in the road and every merchant's birthday. You trail her as she finishes tying down the last jug. You can't pray on an empty stomach, she says, but you can pray on a half pint and some rye. The beer they're delivering today is a mid-strength batch, brewed specifically for trade. Mild enough not to raise suspicions, flavorful enough to keep folks coming back. The journey isn't long, but you can feel how much weight the little cart carries. Not just physically, but symbolically. These barrels represent income, favor, reputation. The convent doesn't have much in terms of gold, but its beer? That's currency. You pass fields of barley swaying under the breeze. A shepherd nods as you go by. A child waves from a distant hedgerow. And at each stop, every cottage, every market stall, there's recognition. These nuns are known. You might think cloistered life meant isolation, but beer was the bridge. It gave nuns a reason to interact with the world, and the world a reason to respect the convent. Not just as a place of piety, but as a center of skill. Pilgrims especially knew the reputation of convent beer. They'd arrive dusty, blistered, and half-starved, but they'd always perk up at the offer of a mug. Some convents even had little pilgrim inns attached, offering food, sleep, and yes, beer, all for a small donation or a bit of manual labor. It was spiritual hospitality at its most practical. You can't meditate on the sins of mankind if you're dehydrated. There are records of convents brewing special pilgrim ale, infused with lavender or licorice to soothe tired bodies. One even claimed to include a drop of sacred well water in every barrel. Historians still argue whether that was literal or just really clever marketing. One curious detail. Some convents use their beer barrels to send messages. That's right, small notes, tucked under the wax seals, recipes, requests, even political gossip. A kind of medieval microblogging system, if you will. One barrel might carry ale and a coded warning about local plague cases. Another might arrive with a folded prayer request from a merchant's wife, who didn't dare write openly. Beer traveled, and with it, so did stories. You arrive in the village just as the sun crests over the thatched rooftops. The market is waking up, carts being unpacked, bread steaming in baskets, and the first scent of roasted onions in the air. Sister Juliana is already haggling with a fishmonger over 2 kegs of ale in exchange for a dozen salted trout, and a promise of next week's lamb shank. Barter was the lifeblood of convent beer. Cash was rare, but beer was always welcome. And not just for thirst, people used it in cooking, medicine, even as pay for day laborers. You help unload a few jugs near the baker's stall. In return, he hands you a warm, crusty loaf, baked with spent grains from the convent's mash. It's hearty, flecked with caraway, and impossibly satisfying. You sit for a moment, chewing slowly as the town stirs around you, and you realize this is community. This is connection, all built weirdly enough on the back of a bubbling cauldron of barley water. The journey back is quieter. The donkey walks slower with less weight in the cart. The sun is higher, warming the path in that drowsy, golden way that makes you think of naps and shadowed cloisters. Sister Juliana hums a tune, something old, wordless, rhythmic like hoofbeats. Back at the convent gate, she pauses before going inside. People think prayer keeps the world turning, she says, but it's the beer that gets them to show up for it. You smile, unsure if she's joking. She doesn't clarify. She just pulls the cart through the archway and disappears into the brewing yard. And somewhere in the village you just left, a widow sips her afternoon pint. A pilgrim sleeps with a full belly. A merchant toasts quietly, grateful for one more day. All because the nuns brewed better beer, and had the wisdom to share it. The air in the cellar is cooler now, sharper. Shadows stretch longer across the stone floor, and the low golden light filtering in from the narrow slit windows seems to bring with it a hush, as if the building itself is settling in for evening prayers. You've come back to where it all ends, or where it should end. But today, something feels off. You catch Sister Felicitas frowning at a barrel. She lifts the lid, sniffs, and mutters something that is definitely not in the Psalms. Her brow furrows, and you can feel the tension ripple through the room. It's not the ingredients, not the water. No, this is something sneakier. Missing beer. She glances at another cask. It's light. Too light, her eyes narrow. It's gone walkabout, she says, half to herself, half to God. It happens more often than you'd think. See, not every visitor to a convent came with purely devotional motives. Not every novice was as pious as her vows. And not every barrel made it to market full. There were whispers, quiet, carefully non-recorded whispers, of certain cellar-based mysteries that kept abbesses up at night. A cracked lid here, a damp spot there, a particularly jolly stable boy who sings too loud and smells faintly of coriander and barley. Scandals in the cellar, they called them, and though rarely documented, they linger in the oral histories, in side-eyed glances between nuns, in references to the unfortunate froth incident of 1371, or the time Sister Agnes accidentally locked herself in with the festive batch for 3 hours and emerged suspiciously merry. Historians still argue whether these tales are exaggerated, meant more to entertain than to inform. But what's clear is this. The brewing hall was sacred, yes. But the cellar, that was liminal. Part holy vault, part temptation. You glance around and notice certain barrels are marked with iron crosses, seals against tampering. Others have carved initials. Some are roped off entirely with faint warnings written in Latin that loosely translate to open only with cause or else. And yet, people did open them. You find an old note wedged in the stone wall, written in a crabby, spidery hand. To the sister who keeps sipping from batch 4, know that God sees. And I do too. Abbess M. Even with vows of poverty and silence, Some sisters still struggled with restraint, especially when the air was thick with steam and cloves and the beer tasted like a holiday in a cup. One report from a visiting friar mentions an unusually spirited mealtime, during which 3 nuns tried to harmonize all of Psalm 91 while hiccuping. And then there were the outsiders. Pilgrims who overstayed. Traveling tradesmen with twitchy fingers. Even the occasional local priest who came by just to bless the barrels, but left looking far more relaxed than when he arrived. Convent doors didn't have locks, but beer cellars? Those did. You crouch beside one particularly darkened corner and see it. A hidden tap, faintly dripping. The floor is sticky. Sister Felicitas sighs. Again, she says. Always the summer ale. She's not angry exactly. More resigned. Like someone who knows that in a place where miracles and malts coexist, mischief is just another part of the divine design. Some convents responded with strict penalties. Brew theft could mean extra chores, prayer vigils, or even fasting from future ale. Others took a more humorous approach. One abbess, in a fit of theatrical punishment, made a novice dress as a foam-topped beer barrel during evening prayers. The message? Sin's not just wrong, it's embarrassing. And yet through it all, the sisters kept brewing. They patched their lids, tightened their taps, whispered to their yeasts, and watched the levels closely. Because the work was worth it, even if the occasional sip went unaccounted for. You lean against a barrel and take in the space, the cool air, the echoes, the faint sense that at any moment a sister might appear, catch your eye, and raise one knowing eyebrow. This wasn't just a workplace, it was a stage, a chapel, a school, and sometimes a comedy. In the far corner, you spot a dusty barrel with faded chalk lettering. The words barely legible. St. Tilda's bold mistake. You ask about it, Felicitas laughs. Oh, we don't open that one anymore. You don't ask why? Some stories are better left sealed. Twilight seeps in slowly like ink soaking into linen, as you find yourself back above ground, drawn by the muffled clatter of wooden wheels and the scent of something oddly sweet. Following it leads you to the loading alcove, a covered nook near the outer convent wall, where barrels are being rolled, bundled, and branded for travel. Tonight's shipment is special. 2 sisters are preparing casks destined for a feast, an actual bishop's banquet at a nearby cathedral. The barrels are freshly waxed, tied with ribbons the color of spring wheat, and etched with the convent seal. A barley stalk looped with a vine of ivy. Elegant, proud, and, if the murmurs are to be believed, more eagerly anticipated than the bishop's homily. These are event beers, crafted not just for nutrition or everyday trade, but for occasions. Festivals, ceremonies, grand gatherings where the beer must do more than quench thirst, it must impress. You walk around one of the barrels and catch a waft of something unusual. Cinnamon? Apple? Is that ginger? Sister Celestine White, who oversees ceremonial brews, is leaning over with a spoon, stirring one final addition into a pitcher. She sees your raised eyebrow and grins. Bishop likes a kick, she says. Apparently, this particular recipe was developed after a rather underwhelming 14th century feast where the monk's beer went flat and someone made the grave mistake of trying to flavor it with turnips. The bishop was not amused. Since then, the sisters have quietly taken over festival brewing duties for certain dioceses. Their ale doesn't just taste good. It arrives with pageantry. Each barrel is adorned with chalked blessing symbols. Protection for travel, preservation for freshness, and, let's be honest, a little extra flair. One sister attaches a pouch of dried lavender to the bung plug. Keeps the demons out, she jokes, or at least the ones who don't like florals. There's a beauty in the whole process, a kind of rustic elegance. The sisters load the barrels with a practiced rhythm, checking sloshes, sniffing for spoilage, and occasionally giving each other pointed looks if something seems off. It's not just about making a good beer, it's about sending a message. We know what we're doing, and we care. But the story doesn't end when the barrel rolls out of the convent. In fact, in some ways, that's where the fun begins. Once convent beer left the gates, it entered a world of medieval logistics that was both chaotic and charming. Donkeys, oxen, and two-wheeled carts carried ale over rutted roads to bustling markets, private manors, and sometimes across regional borders. Some barrels never made it. Others became very well traveled. There's an account of a single barrel from an abbey near Ghent that was rerouted 3 times due to flooding, taxation, and one suspiciously aggressive goose. It arrived 3 weeks late, unshaken, still sealed, and by most reports, even better after the wait. These deliveries weren't just commerce, they were diplomacy. Convents earned reputations. A well-brewed ale could smooth over disputes, open doors, even secure alliances. It wasn't unusual for nobility to request that fine cinnamon strawberry ale from the Sisters of St. Gertrude by name. You ask Sister Celestine if they worry about others copying their recipes. She snorts. Let them try. Without our weather, our water, our yeast, but that all they'll get is wet bread in a jug. You follow her to a chalkboard listing outgoing orders. Beside each one is a scribbled note. Father Merrick, no wormwood this time. The Baroness, floral, not fruity. Market day, use strong cask, goose-pecked. Last one. You can't help but smile. Every delivery is personal, tailored, infused with intention. As the sun dips below the horizon, a final cart is loaded. The donkey brays in protest, then ambles off down the road, its wooden wheels clicking into rhythm like the ticking of a sleepy metronome. And just before it vanishes, Sister Celestine raises her hand, fingers crossed in a small, quiet benediction. Not for the donkey, for the beer. Because once it leaves their hands, it's no longer just a drink. It's a message in a barrel, a sip of convent life, a whisper of prayer brewed with herbs and human effort. And if the bishop smiles a little more than usual at dinner tonight, well, that's just good fermentation. You wake early the next morning to the sound of laughter, soft, breathy, and barely contained. Peeking into the courtyard, you see a group of sisters huddled around a pile of bundled cloth. At first you think it's laundry, then the scent hits you. Warm grain, caramel, a hint of toast. Bread? Not quite. They're brewing again, already. This time, the brew isn't just for trade or the bishop's banquet. It's internal. For the convent. For the daily rhythms that stretch from matins to compline. You follow them into the brewing yard, where a new fire's already been lit beneath the great copper kettle. Sister Marcella greets you with a wink. Time to sweat for the Lord. This batch, she explains, is a tribute to their founders. A classic recipe known as sororum primus, the sisters first. Simple, hearty, forgiving. You're handed a sack of grain. Barley, coarsely crushed, smelling nutty and warm. You haul it to the mash tun, an oversized wooden tub that somehow still holds warmth from yesterday's fire, and pour it in. Steam rises like a ghost, and soon the air smells like porridge and memory. You stir slowly, carefully. The paddle is long and heavier than expected. Sister Marcella nods in approval. You're learning. But just as your shoulders start to ache, something curious happens. The other nuns begin to sing, not loudly, not performatively, just together. A simple refrain, layered and round, echoing gently off the stone walls. You've entered one of the convent's oldest traditions, brewing hymns. Not every convent practiced it, but this one did. Songs sung during brewing weren't just for morale. They helped mark time, how long to stir, how long to steep. The refrain changes when it's time to add herbs. A rising line signals the shift to the next task. It's like liturgy with yeast. One fringe record even suggests some convents believed certain musical modes improved fermentation. Was it science? Was it prayer? Historians still argue. But one thing's certain. This part of the day feels holy in its own way. And the song, it's about bread and beer and peace. A line repeats in Latin, panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie. Give us this day our daily bread. You realize how closely beer and bread were entwined here. Sometimes literally, using the same grains baked from the spent mash. In lean times, it was beer that carried them through. Liquid bread. Drinkable hope. By mid-morning, the mash is ready. You help strain it through layers of cloth, pouring the thick, sweet wort into a new kettle. The steam fogs your face. The nuns don't stop moving. One's feeding chickens with leftover husks. Another is sketching new chalk marks onto barrels. But there's a joy here. A lightness. Brewing day, despite the labor, is a favorite. Sister Theodora, who's now ladling in herbs from the garden, tells you that brewing was often the space where younger sisters found their footing. Not everyone takes to scripture right away, but brewing? Brewing made sense. It required timing, attention, intuition. You could fail and try again. You could experiment within limits. It was, she says with a grin, where the convent got its flavor. You notice how democratic the process feels. Everyone has a role, no one is idle. The abbess herself appears at one point, not to supervise, but to help carry water. There's no sense of rank here, just rhythm. And that rhythm pulses quietly beneath the surface of their lives. Brewing is not separate from prayer, it is prayer. A form of meditation through motion, of presence through process. You look around and realize, these aren't women out of time. They're not stuck in some distant past. They're engineers, scientists, artists, running a production line with medieval tools and monkish determination. You glance again at the copper kettle, now bubbling, and feel the pull of legacy. How many batches before this one? How many sisters stood exactly where you're standing, stirring the same grain, breathing the same misty morning air? You'll never know, but you're part of it now. A soft bell rings. Not the harsh clang of prayer, but a lighter tone. Hey, it signals a break. The nuns wipe their hands, some removing their brewing aprons, others sitting down on overturned barrels with slices of bread and mugs of cool ale. You take a sip. It's yesterday's batch. Matured just enough. Light, bready, calming. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter, by steam, by women who have spent centuries mastering something the world tried to forget, you understand. They weren't brewing for survival. They were brewing for each other. You stay seated on your overturned barrel, mug warm in hand, as the soft buzz of the convent settles into a lull. The post-brew break is a kind of communal exhale. Bread is passed, a wedge of sharp cheese shared with surprising generosity, and a few nuns stretch their legs under the sun in absolute silence like cats who've earned their rest. But it wasn't always this peaceful. Sister Anselma, perched beside you with a small knife and a half-peeled apple, leans over and murmurs, "It used to be easier." You raise an eyebrow, she continues. "Before the taxes, before the guilds, before they came for our kettles." And just like that, the mood shifts. A breeze picks up. A bird calls from the orchard, strangely off-key. Welcome to the slow decline. It didn't happen all at once, of course. No one stormed the convent, demanding the nuns surrender their wooden mash paddles. But over the years, centuries even, things changed. And they changed against the sisters. The first blow came quietly. New taxes on brewing. As cities expanded and beer became not just a necessity but an industry, governments, especially in the late medieval and early modern periods, realized there was money in malt. Laws began appearing that taxed brewing by the batch, by the barrel, even by the strength of the beer itself. For monasteries with resources, this was annoying. For convents, it was devastating. They didn't brew in high volume, they couldn't absorb the cost. Some were forced to cut their batches in half, which meant less to drink, less to trade, less to offer the poor. Records show at least 3 convents in 15th century France that had to suspend brewing entirely due to tax pressure. One abbess described it in a letter as a fast not of holiness but of necessity. And then came the guilds. Brewing guilds, male-dominated and increasingly powerful, began to control who could brew, where it could be sold, and under what conditions. They framed their efforts as a way to protect quality, but the subtext was clear. Control the market, exclude the competition, especially the female competition. Historians still debate how widespread this suppression was. Some claim convents retained brewing rights in certain regions well into the 17th century. Others argue that even when allowed, they were priced out or pushed into lower status markets. What's certain is that it became harder. Harder to sell, harder to barter, harder to brew freely without inspection or suspicion. One particularly bitter law in parts of the Holy Roman Empire required all beer brewed by women to be approved by a male guild inspector. The irony? Many of those inspectors had learned to brew from nuns in the first place. You sip your ale and glance around the courtyard, now cast in golden light. It's hard to imagine this place in decline, and yet the signs are there. Some of the barrels are patched with salvaged wood. The copper kettle has a dent the size of a boot heel. A few herbs in the garden are overgrown, unpicked, perhaps because the sister who tended them left, or was never replaced. The convent survives, but it no longer thrives. Sister Anselma folds her apple peel neatly onto a napkin and tells you about the last time their beer was taxed, nearly 80 years ago. They protested politely with a letter and a single bottle of their best brew. We said, "Taste this and tell us it deserves punishment." She grins. We got no reply, but the tax disappeared for a year. You wonder how many small victories like that are scattered throughout history, uncatalogued, but real. Eventually, some convents gave up brewing altogether. Others shifted to producing mead, wine, or herbal tonics, hoping to dodge new restrictions. A few turned inward, brewing only for their sisters, never for trade. Their recipes faded, their tools rusted, their songs stopped. And yet, not all was lost. Some convents, like this one, held on, quietly, steadily. They brewed smaller, smarter, they adapted, used what they had, taught new novices in secret, kept their yeast cultures alive in hidden cloths passed hand to hand like relics. You suddenly understand that this isn't just beer, it's resistance. In soft robes and worn sandals, in verses and vapor and centuries of stirring. As the bell rings for vespers, the sisters rise. You help gather the mugs, wipe the table, brush away crumbs. But in your chest, something lingers. It's not sadness exactly, it's reverence. For the women who brewed not just through adversity, but because of it. You look to the copper kettle one more time. It's quiet now, resting. Like them, it still holds warmth. Word count, 1078. Awaiting continue. You said continue. ChatGPT said section 13. The day fades into evening, and with it the convent's pulse slows. Tasks are fewer, voices gentler, steps measured. You find yourself back in the archive room, dust motes spinning in slanted light, following Sister Adelgundi's, one of the oldest nuns, and the last to ever hold the title, Brewmistress Emerita. She's thin, wiry, and moves like someone who knows exactly how heavy a water bucket should be and how fast yeast should rise on a humid day. She opens a wooden chest near the back of the room. It creaks, of course it does, and from within she lifts a bottle. Modern. Glass. Capped. Labeled with a faintly familiar barley and ivy seal. You blink. Because this isn't medieval beer. This is recent. Commercial. Real world. It's ours, she says simply. Welcome to the Echo. Turns out the story didn't end in taxes and decline, at least not entirely. In the last few decades, small breweries around the world, run by lay people, historians, even the occasional nun, have begun reviving ancient brewing methods. Recipes pulled from old convent books. Herbs grown from medieval seed strains. Even yeast culture supposedly descended from monastic kitchens. The world has rediscovered nun-brewed beer, and the results, surprisingly modern. You take the bottle. Its label reads Cervicia Sororum, a nod to the old Latin name you saw in the scriptorium. The ingredients are listed plainly: barley, water, wild hops, mugwort, sweet woodruff. No preservatives, no carbonation. Just the taste of centuries. You want to try it? Sister Adelgundis asks. You hesitate. She laughs softly. It won't make you holy, just hydrate it. You open the bottle and pour it into a clay mug. The scent is earthy, floral, and slightly tart. You sip. It tastes alive. Not flashy, not trendy. Just honest. Like bread that's been left to rise slowly, like a song hummed under breath. Like something made by hand, not machine. Many craft breweries today pay tribute to nun brewers in their marketing. St. Bridget Blonde Ale, Hildegard's Hops, or even Silent Vesper Saison. Some are corny, others sincere, but all of them point back to the forgotten reality that before brewing became business, it was devotion, care, quiet expertise honed by women in places the world rarely looked. Some even go further. In Belgium, a group of women historians recreated a full convent brew system, using period tools. In Germany, an all-women brew collective studies nun recipes for a beer symposium. And in parts of the U.S., breweries partner with convents to donate proceeds to charity, bringing beer back to its community-centered roots. Historians still argue over what's authentic, what counts as revival, and what's just nostalgic branding. But maybe that's missing the point. Maybe it's not about precise replication. Maybe it's about honoring what mattered, the intention. You look down at the bottle and notice a tiny quote printed under the seal. Let each brew be a kindness. Simple. Humble. Perfect. You ask Sister Adelgundis how she feels, seeing all this revival. The names, the nods, the tributes. She shrugs. We were never trying to be remembered, she says. We were just trying to make something that helped people. Then she looks at you, eyes twinkling. But I suppose a little recognition doesn't hurt. You laugh. You both sip. The moment lingers like good foam in a quiet mug. And in that moment, you see it clearly. The legacy of the Brewing Sisters isn't just in recipes or rituals. It's in the way they worked. Thoughtfully, lovingly, with care and humility. It's in how they endured, how they turned grain into comfort, water into sustenance, time into something worth drinking. You wonder what other hidden crafts we've forgotten. What skills lie dormant, waiting to be stirred awake with patience and purpose. The bottle's almost empty now. The sun has vanished. The candles flicker with evening resolve. Sister Adelgundis rises, gently returns the bottle to its chest, and closes the lid. Back to the archives, she says. And just like that, the past is quiet again. But not gone. You find yourself rising earlier now, before the bells even, drawn back to the brewing yard by instinct. There's a stillness in the pre-dawn air, the kind of hush that seems to say, we haven't begun yet, but we're ready. And today, you're going to try it. Not watching, not tasting, not scribbling curious notes like a time-traveling food blogger. Today, you brew. It starts with water. Always water. Sister Perpetua hands you a bucket and points toward the well. The walk is longer than you remember. The bucket's heavier than it looks. You haul it back, arms aching, forearms splashed, feeling like a medieval gym class dropout. She doesn't judge. She just sets it near the kettle and nods. Again. You realize, maybe for the first time, what it takes to get to beer. The grain is already crushed, yesterday's work, but it must be measured and mashed. You watch closely. Scoop by scoop, the nuns work in rhythm. No one rushes, no one stalls. The water heats not to boiling, but to just right, a temperature felt more by fingertip than thermometer. You stir. The mash is heavy, like thick oatmeal, and it clings to the paddle. You ache by the third turn. By the fifth, you start to hum a little. Out of breath, maybe. But something clicks. It's not just the motion, it's the presence. The intentionality. Brew day isn't chaos, it's choreography. One nun brings out her yeast cloth, a woven bundle kept wrapped in linen, containing the same yeast strain her convent has nurtured for decades, maybe centuries. It smells yeasty, like apples left on a windowsill too long. Familiar and wild. You ask what would happen if they lost it. She simply says, "We'd start again." You marvel at that. No fear, no panic. Just begin again. That's the heart of this work, isn't it? Not chasing perfection, but honoring process. You stir slower. At mid-morning, the fire must be tended. Wood split, ash cleared. You volunteer and immediately regret it when you realize medieval kindling is not user-friendly. A sister hands you a flint. You blink. She grins. Offer a small prayer and then strike. Eventually, the fire catches. The copper pot begins to hum. The mash sweetens. The scent in the air is like roasted cereal with faint notes of hay and almond. This isn't about novelty anymore. You're not pretending. You're working. And every movement, every ladle, every bucket, every cloth draped carefully over fermenting wort feels rooted. Sister Winifred, who once terrified you with her enormous stirring paddle, pats your shoulder. "You've got the shoulders for it," she says. Compliment of the week. You assist with flavoring. Today's batch calls for mild hops, dried lemon balm, and a whisper of coriander. Not too much, warns a novice. Last time we had giggling at lauds. It's always a balance. The beer must soothe, not distract. Comfort, not entertain. It should arrive like a second breath, unexpected but needed. Historians still argue whether brewing roles were rotated weekly or assigned permanently within convents. But here you get the sense that once a sister found her rhythm, she kept it. There's joy in returning to the same task, in refining, adjusting, whispering to yeast like old friends. At one point, your hand slips. A small scoop of malt spills onto the ground. You freeze. Sister Agnes chuckles and sweeps it up with a wooden scoop. "The earth will drink what we spill," she says, "and maybe we'll get lucky with the clover next spring." Even mistakes have a place here. You don't realize how tired you are until you sit for lunch. Your hands smell like fire and herbs. There's flour in your hair, but your heart is light. And then, after the meal, you're invited into the old storeroom, where finished barrels are kept cool. You help rack one, lifting, balancing, praying silently you don't tip it, and roll it into position. Sister Theodora marks it with chalk. Batch 241. Quiet Thursday. Cloudy morning. You ask if that's important. She nods. When the beer is opened months from now, we'll taste this day again. That's what it is, isn't it? Brewing is time travel. It captures a moment, weather, mood, sunlight, prayer, and preserves it in foam. You're not just making beer, you're bottling memory. By evening, the brewing is done. The yeast is tucked into warm corners. The cloths are rinsed. The fire dies down, slowly. You step back and look at your hands. They're scratched, stained. They look like they belong here. Evening draws a long, soft curtain across the sky. The shadows settle into place like old friends returning to their seats, and the convent breathes differently now, quieter, slower, more inward. You wander the halls with no aim. The day is done. The brewing is done. But something in you isn't quite ready to sleep. Not yet. You find yourself in the chapel, not for mass, but for stillness. The walls are cool. The floor hums faintly with the last steps of the day's prayers. And near the altar, lit only by flickering beeswax, sits a small mug. Yes, a mug. You blink. Is it forgotten? Left behind? You approach. It's half full. A modest portion. And tucked beneath it is a note on folded parchment. for the last hand to clean the mash paddle. You smile, that was you. So you sit, sip, and in that moment, everything slows. The ale is light, barely carbonated, with a taste like warm bread kissed by citrus. You imagine it's from a batch a few weeks ago. Maybe longer. The flavor has mellowed, smoothed. Like something that used to be sharper but has decided to let go. Much like this place. You've spent days among the brewing sisters. You've stirred, hauled, tasted, burned your knuckles on copper, spilled wort down your boots, sung while scrubbing, and now you finally sat still long enough to realize you get it. It's not about beer. It never was. It's about the rhythm. Wake, pray, brew, work, rest, repeat. They didn't chase fame. They didn't advertise. They didn't beg to be remembered. They just brewed. Day in, day out, through famine, tax, plague, reforms, raids, decline, and silence. And somehow, their story found its way back to you. You think of the first nun who stirred mash in this very place. Of the one who whispered to yeast. Of the one who made up names for her best brews and chuckled into her sleeve when no one was looking. Of the one who quietly patched a broken barrel so her sisters wouldn't go without at dinner. Their fingerprints are still here. You touch the wall beside you, it's cool, smooth, but beneath that there's texture. There's time. You finish the ale, leave the mug where you found it, and walk out into the open courtyard, where stars have begun to gather overhead, like visitors at a quiet feast. The brewing yard is still, the mash tun washed, the herbs sleeping in their jars. The copper kettle shines faintly under the moonlight, resting after another day of transformation. And it's then, finally, that your body begins to soften. Shoulders dropping, breathing deepening. You lie back on a wooden bench, eyes half open, listening. There's no chant now, no laughter, just the rustling of ivy and the whisper of wind across the stone. But beneath it all, you hear it, the heartbeat of the place. A rhythm so soft, so steady that it feels like your own. And maybe it is. Because the truth is, you didn't just learn about brewing. You lived it. You entered its rhythm. You became part of it. And now it's time to let that rhythm carry you. So close your eyes now. Let your breath follow the soft rise and fall of that convent rhythm. Inhale, like the scent of warm grain at dawn. Exhale, like the quiet crackle of a dying fire beneath the kettle. No need to rush. There's nowhere to be. Nothing left to stir. The day has done its work. Picture yourself walking once more through those stone halls. The candlelight flickers gently against the walls. Your steps echo faintly, but no one stirs. The brewing pots are cleaned. The mash is resting. The yeast is tucked away, humming softly to itself in the dark. You pass by the herb room, lavender and lemon balm wrapped in linen. You pause. Breathe in. Let the fragrance fill you with calm. Outside, the stars keep watch, over the barrels, over the fields, over the sisters already dreaming. And now they watch over you too. You lie down on a straw-filled mattress, or maybe just the bench beneath the trees. The cool night air brushes your cheek. A distant owl calls once, then falls silent. You feel the weight of the day fall away like a cloak. And in its place, peace. Gentle, steady, brewed from warmth and work and quiet joy. Let it hold you, let it keep you. Sleep now, you've earned it. End of script. Sweet dreams.